Archival microanchors, April 17, 1943. Naga Hills, Assam border. IJA Courier Unit log. Number 47, inspected by Captain Shinichi Okabe. Dawn seeped through the folds of the Naga Hills like pale smoke. Beneath the dripping canopy, a runner appeared. Barefoot, ribs showing through his sodden khaki shirt, a leather satchel strapped tight against his chest. His name never made it to the rosters, but the logbook at Fort Myitkyina recorded him at 04:12 hours, carrying a single wax-sealed pouch marked Imperial Courier, Burma Front. That pouch would travel faster than any column could march. It would leap valleys by rope bridge, reach the misted airfields at Kengtung, and rise into the slipstream of a Nakajima Ki-34 Thora transport bound for Rangoon. By the time it landed, men had already died on the route it described, a trail no map yet showed, where couriers ran instead of trucks, and where airdrops wrote new roads across jungle mountains. How did an empire stretched to breaking keep its arteries pulsing through monsoon and disease? How did messages outrun hunger, dysentery, and Allied patrols slicing through the clouds? In the spring of 1943, the war in the Pacific had turned into a contest not of firepower, but of endurance. The Japanese Army's Courier Corps, unarmed, underfed, half-forgotten, became its silent bloodline. Each runner carried more than a pouch. He carried the Empire's illusion of control. A Red Cross inspection memo from August 1943 found, decades later in Geneva, listed irregular communications, jungle transmission paths unfit for animal use. Yet these same paths ferried orders that reached entire divisions. They carried the news of Imphal, the surrender at Buna, and the first whispers of defeat. This is the story of the invisible front, the couriers, airdrop pilots, and villagers who carved a ghost road across Asia. Through them, we trace the pulse of a dying empire, one message at a time. The jungle before dawn was a moving wall of breath. Mist clung to the vines like old silk, dripping from bamboo canes and the broad shoulders of men who had not eaten properly in days. Along a narrow ridge north of Fort Myitkyina, the first courier column of the morning began its climb. The men wore faded khaki shorts, torn from the thighs down, and sandals cut from truck tires. Their packs weighed no more than 5 kilograms, but inside those packs, sealed in oiled paper, were the written arteries of the empire. Dispatches marked Southern Expeditionary Army, Urgent Rangoon. At 04:12 hours, the first man passed the log gate. His name was Private Tetsuo Araki, 19 years old, assigned to the 55th Division Courier Section. The duty officer recorded him in the April 17, 1943 entry. Departure toward Homolin, via jungle path east of Naga Hills. After that, the trail vanished into silence. The path he followed was not drawn on any official map. It was maintained by villagers paid in rice, sometimes by salt, sometimes by promises. Every 10 kilometers, a hollow bamboo pole marked a rest point. There, a runner could drink from a gourd, replace his message packet, and continue. They moved in pairs, sometimes alone, carrying no weapon but a bayonet. Mosquitoes filled the air like static. In one ICRC field memo from August 1943, an inspector described these corridors as paths unfit for animal use yet daily crossed by human couriers bearing sealed communications. Japan's courier network in Burma was its bloodstream, but by mid-1943, the blood was thinning. Allied bombers had severed rail lines at Mandalay, and the motor roads from Bangkok to Rangoon had become mud by the monsoon. Without gasoline, the Imperial Army reverted to the muscle of men. What trucks once hauled, bare feet now carried. Messages, quinine, bandages, dried fish. Imagine it. A world where the fastest thing was a human heartbeat. Each runner consumed roughly 1,900 calories per day, drawn from ration rice and pickled daikon. The heat alone could strip a man of 2 liters of sweat before noon. Couriers sometimes chewed betel nut to dull the hunger. Others rubbed camphor oil across their chests to fool their own sense of exhaustion. Araki's unit log recorded 7 men leaving Myitkyina that week. Only 4 returned. One diary, later recovered by Allied forces, contained a line in pencil. "When the fog lifts, we vanish." It was signed only with initials. TA. Perhaps it was Iraqis. Why did these men keep running? Was it faith in the emperor's orders, or fear of vanishing into the jungle's anonymity? The officers promised medals, but none were ever minted. The empire's pulse depended on men no one would remember, and yet in the villages they crossed, memory took root. An old woman in a Kamti recalled, in an interview recorded by Burmese radio in 1961, how her mother gave water to a Japanese courier. He drank, bowed, and left one button behind. We kept it like a coin. There is irony in that gesture. As Tokyo broadcast propaganda of invincibility, its armies survived by the charity of those it had conquered. By sunset, the fog returned. Couriers lit no fires. The glow could give them away to Chindit patrols sweeping east. They ate cold rice from palm leaves and listened to the jungle, cicadas, rain, the distant thump of artillery far to the south. Each sound could mean survival or discovery. When the empire's radio stations fell silent, these couriers kept Japan's orders breathing. They were not heroes by choice. They were lungs gasping through mud and fever, keeping a dying machine alive a few days longer. And as their footsteps faded into the night, one question lingers, like the mist above the ridge. How long can an empire live on the strength of those it forgets? By mid-1943, the jungles between Homalin and Kohima had turned into a slow-moving sea of men. The empire's couriers were no longer individual runners. They had become a relay, a living conveyor belt stretching from the rice depots of Bahamo to the crumbling airstrips outside Rangoon. Each man carried a piece of the war's pulse, orders, casualty lists, and coded weather sheets that dictated when the next air raid might strike. The Army Supply Bureau's June 1943 ration table allotted 1,900 calories per courier per day, half the standard infantry issue. The margin between endurance and collapse was measured in a handful of rice grains. A report from the same month noted declining body weight in forward couriers, incidents of jungle rot and malaria up 27%, yet the messages kept moving. A single sealed envelope marked to headquarters might cross 260 kilometers in 7 days, faster by then than any remaining truck. Every 20 miles, the terrain changed character. River crossings demanded rafts stitched from bamboo and inner tubes scavenged from grounded trucks. In the high ridges where clouds scraped the ground, couriers sometimes tied themselves together with rope to keep from disappearing into ravines. They learned to read the jungle, not by compass but by smell. The sharp rot of sago meant lowlands, the pepper scent of teak meant climbing. Corporal Masanobu Hara, who survived the war and later testified before the War History Office in Tokyo, remembered it simply. We walked where maps refused to follow. Still, the empire tried to impose order on chaos. Dispatch posts kept strict records, often stamped with the red seal of the 55th Division Courier Command. Each packet was weighed, wrapped in oilcloth, and tagged with a departure hour. The irony was that beyond the first ridge, none of it mattered. Schedules dissolved in monsoon rain. Clocks rusted in their cases. The only reliable measure was how far a man could walk before his breath turned shallow. Contrast that with the Allied side. At Dinjan airfield in Assam, U.S. supply pilots took off every 30 minutes, their C-47 Dakotas carrying medical crates, typewriters, even chocolate bars, symbols of an industrial world humming beyond the clouds. Below them, the Japanese couriers slipped through mud, delivering orders on foot that would reach their targets days late. A Red Cross observer in Rangoon, reporting that same summer, noted the disparity. The enemy's sky is filled with engines, ours with footsteps. What did those footsteps sound like to the villagers who heard them passing in the fog? Some whispered prayers, some locked their doors, others traded water or fruit in silence. In places like Lahe and Tamu, the courier's arrival was both feared and pitied, soldiers too hungry to threaten, too proud to beg. One Burmese boy, interviewed decades later, recalled how a runner once collapsed outside his hut, clutching a dispatch pouch, smelling of ink and salt. By then, the empire's vision of expansion, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, had shrunk to a damp satchel and a pair of bleeding feet. Yet within that collapse, a strange resilience took hold. Couriers began inventing their own codes, replacing missing words with jungle terms. Rainbird arrived meant the air route was cut. Bamboo sleeps meant safe passage. Language itself adapted to terrain, bending like vines around the truth. When Myitkyina finally fell in 1944, Allied officers opened dozens of abandoned courier pouches. Inside, they found orders written weeks earlier, instructions to units that no longer existed, signed by officers already dead. The ink had blurred, but the effort remained, a testament to a desperate discipline. As the last light faded over the ridgeline, the jungle swallowed their traces once more. But listen closely even now, in the heavy hush between monsoon bursts, and you can almost hear it, the ghost rhythm of bare feet over wet leaves, carrying a nation's last breath towards silence. The sky above the Indo-Burma frontier, July 1943, was not silent. It droned ceaselessly with the hum of Allied engines. At Palel Airfield, 30 miles southeast of Imphal, ground crews in oil-stained khaki rolled wooden crates across the tarmac toward the waiting Douglas C-47 Dakotas. The air smelled of high-octane fuel and wet grass. Radio towers blinked red through drifting monsoon clouds. According to the RAF Palel Air Operations Log of July 1943, 216 sorties were flown that month alone, each carrying food, ammunition, quinine, and letters to men cut off in the jungle, across the border. In the shrouded valleys near Tidim, Japanese supply officers watched the same clouds with envy. Their men were starving on the hillsides below. What the Allies lifted by air, Japan still tried to drag by hand. Every box parachuted into the mist was a small humiliation, a reminder that the Empire's machine had stalled. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Transport Section, in its report number 32, Rangoon, Aug. 1943, admitted the gap. Enemy aerial resupply outpaces ground movement tenfold. Urgent need for domestic airdrop development. It was a sterile line, typed on thin paper, but beneath it lay desperation. So the Japanese command attempted to rewrite the laws of their own logistics. Bamboo and rice paper workshops sprouted in Bangkok and Rangoon, improvising parachutes from discarded silk kimonos and medical gauze. Mechanics converted Nakajima Ki-34 Thora transports into crude cargo planes, ripping out passenger seats to fit fuel drums and rice sacks. Pilots trained on short jungle runways, where wild pigs sometimes wandered across the strip. Each flight was a wager against weather and time. The monsoon rose like a living wall. One misjudged gust could shred a parachute or drown a propeller. Yet the Empire persisted, because its soldiers in the hills were fading. At Fort Tamu, reports spoke of rations dropping below 1.2 kilograms of rice per man per day, with salt rations cut entirely. A surviving pilot's diary, later catalogued at the Tokyo Defense Archives, records his dread before a night drop over Homolin. We carry 10 sacks. Each sack is a heartbeat. From 5,000 feet, the jungle below looked like an endless sea, green, rippling, and merciless. Flares marked drop zones cleared by machete. When the bamboo-framed crates struck the canopy, many burst apart, scattering food into the mud. Still, when the couriers found them, they knelt as though retrieving relics. Meanwhile, Allied observers tracked these efforts with clinical precision. A U.S. War Department dispatch from Calcutta noted that Japanese supply flights appear uncoordinated, payload under 1 ton, losses due to terrain. The contrast was staggering. A single Allied Dakota could deliver 6,000 pounds per run. Japan's converted transports barely managed $900. In the villages, the difference was visible from the ground. When Allied planes passed, children ran to catch falling ration tins marked with USA canned beef No. 2. When Japanese planes came, they watched in silence. No tins, only the occasional torn sack, its rice spilling like pale rain. A Red Cross inspector visiting Rangoon in late 1943 described the spectacle succinctly. The war is now vertical. Those who command the sky dictate who eats. And yet, in this imbalance, a strange kind of faith endured among the Japanese units still hidden in the jungle. They spoke of the Tenku no Michi, the road in the sky. It was not a strategy. It was a prayer. If the earth had betrayed them, perhaps the air would carry them home. But even prayers need wings stronger than bamboo. As August 1943 faded into rain, one final entry in the Air Transport Section log reads, 5 aircraft dispatched, 1 returned. Weather beyond expectation. From that line alone, you can almost hear the storm closing in, swallowing the planes, the pilots, and the last illusion that the Empire could still control its own supply of life. By September 1943, the Empire's air experiment had shifted from command to craft. In the humid workshops of Bangkok Arsenal, the sound of the war was no longer artillery. It was the hiss of sewing needles through cloth. The production note number 244, dated September 1943, opened bluntly. Silk stocks exhausted. Substitute with hemp and paper fiber. Trial series of parachutes to commence. There, in a row of low wooden buildings beside the Chao Phraya River, women bent over tables under the wavering light of oil lamps. Their fingers stitched together scraps of rice paper, muslin, and even the lining of discarded kimono sleeves. Each parachute panel was pressed flat with stones to keep the moisture from curling it. When a test drop succeeded, the workers cheered softly, careful not to waste breath in the heat. The Asahi Shimbun newspaper printed a proud story that month. Its headline read, "Women at Work for the Sky Road." It described housewives and students in makeshift uniform aprons, sewing courage into every thread. The article was meant to inspire, to hide the scarcity behind romance. But between the lines, the shortage spoke louder. Japan's empire, once roaring across continents, now depended on the patience of needle and thread. In Rangoon, engineers at Mingaladon Air Depot tested the new designs by dropping sandbags over the Hlaga Lake. Some opened, some didn't. When one failed, the water erupted into a grey plume, and the officers scribbled quietly into notebooks, payload lost, pattern unfit. They had no silk left for another trial. The results were uneven. Hemp cords snapped in the damp. Paper panels tore under monsoon gusts, yet each failure was catalogued meticulously. A transport officer's log, recovered after the war, lists 47 parachutes produced in Bangkok that month, of which 12 serviceable. Even so, the program continued. It had to. Entire regiments in the Arakan Hills were surviving on air-dropped rice, no heavier than a man's daily ration. At night, the women at the arsenal listened to distant radio reports from the front. They knew that every hour of sewing meant another life sustained, somewhere they would never see. In one recorded recollection, seamstress Akiko Tsuda, then 22, remembered a moment when the factory ran out of thread. "We used unraveled fishing nets. We said the fish would forgive us." Meanwhile, Allied leaflets rained across Thailand and Burma, promising food and medicine for those who surrendered. On the ground, even Japanese supply officers couldn't ignore the irony. At Fort Tiddim, an intercepted Allied crate revealed tins of corned beef labeled Swift and Cameras, Chicago. The soldiers inside tasted it and called it metal butter. The contrast between that, tin's clean surface, and their own mud-caked hands was too sharp to forget. A British reconnaissance report from October 1943 noted unusual paper debris in jungle clearings, possibly experimental Japanese parachutes. The Allies didn't yet realize that what they were seeing wasn't innovation, it was survival crafted by desperation. By year's end, bamboo frames replaced crates, ropes replaced steel cables, and rice paper replaced silk. Every drop became a gamble. Would the food land intact or dissolve into the forest floor? The Japanese called it Kumo no Michi, the cloud road. To fly even briefly was to defy gravity and fate, but the Empire's aerial lifeline was fraying faster than it was sewn. As the women in Bangkok tied off each bundle with trembling hands, monsoon winds tore another glider from the sky. 1 month later, the Air Transport Section's final note on the project read, "Paper wings sufficient for morale, insufficient for weight." That line would become a prophecy. The Empire's war effort, stitched together by human endurance, was unraveling thread by thread. And somewhere beyond the clouds, Allied aircraft still droned, tracing bright silver paths across a sky Japan no longer owned. June 1944. The rain had not stopped for 40 days. The air over the Chin Hills was thick with decay, gun oil, wet uniforms, and the sweet rot of bamboo. Below the ridgeline, remnants of Japan's 55th Division Courier Corps moved in single file, each man carrying a soaked dispatch pouch strapped beneath his tunic. Their orders were simple: reach Imphal. But the trails had vanished, washed away by monsoon landslides, and the movement of the Indian National Army, INA, now fighting under the Axis flag. In the fog near Tamu, the jungle turned into a trap. On June 17, 1944, an INA patrol intercepted 3 Japanese couriers crossing a river swollen to the color of rust. The INA field memo logged it coldly. Captured enemy runners. Contents: 1 sealed message cylinder, rice rations for 2 days, 1 damaged compass. Those messages, when opened, contained a grim report. Supply routes collapsed. Couriers lost in terrain. Request air resupply immediate. The irony was unbearable. The very men pleading for airdrops had carried that plea on foot, through the same killing rain that made those drops impossible. Further north, the British War Department POW log RM2842 recorded their fates. The surviving courier, name given as Private T. Araki, confessed under questioning that he had been walking for 9 days without direction. His only compass, he said, was the flow of the river and the sound of distant artillery. The British officer wrote in the margin almost kindly, "Exhausted beyond hostility." The war in Burma had entered its slow implosion. Japan's courier lines, once threading through jungle arteries, were collapsing under starvation and mud. Orders no longer reached their targets. Divisions fought blind. A radio operator at Fort Tiddim wrote in his log that week, "No signal from Homolin for 13 days. Runners unaccounted. The front was dissolving into silence." By contrast, Allied communications were symphonic. From Imphal, coded messages leapt by radio to Calcutta, and from Calcutta to Delhi, where operators drank tea beside humming transmitters. It was a war of voices against footsteps. A strange inversion occurred along those lines. The INA patrols, many of them Indian men who had once served under British command, now faced Japanese soldiers whose language they barely understood. Some exchanged food before battle, small gestures of survival cutting across ideology. One witness recalled a moment near Kabau Valley when an INA sergeant tossed a half-eaten mango to a starving courier before leading him away as prisoner. That half-eaten fruit would later appear in testimony. A tiny, human punctuation in the sentence of an empire's collapse. Back in Rangoon, officers at the air transport section still drafted reports about imminent recovery of the Myitkyina corridor. They were writing to ghosts. The couriers who should have delivered those papers lay scattered through the jungle, their messages unread, their bodies folded into the terrain. What happens to a war when its words stop moving? An Allied interpreter in Imphal, reviewing the recovered pouches, wrote that most of the papers had blurred beyond recognition. He described them as letters melted into rain. The last known dispatch from the 55th Division Courier Corps, dated June 29, 1944, ends with a single sentence, "We continue, though the road is gone." By then, the Empire's silence had become its own message, an unspoken admission carried by the monsoon wind, echoing across mountains where even echoes refused to return. The rain had finally eased by July 1944, leaving behind a jungle glistening like an oil painting. The trails around Homolin were quiet now, too quiet. The air smelled of mildew and rusted ammunition. Where the couriers once passed every dawn, only the hum of insects remained. A letter was found weeks later near a collapsed bamboo bridge at Thanan, wrapped in waterproof silk and still sealed with wax. The Tokyo National Archives catalogue Ref 8317B records it as anonymous courier correspondence, recovered July 1944. Its first line read, "To my mother in Nagasaki, I am still running." The handwriting faltered halfway down the page, the ink bled by moisture. No name followed, only a date and a faint thumbprint. That letter would become a relic, the voice of a vanished corps. By late 1944, Japan's courier network in Burma had disintegrated entirely. The Red Cross parcel count from October 1944 noted that no supply records existed for forward jungle units beyond the Chindwin. Even the humanitarian relief chains had gone blind. Food parcels meant for the wounded were found unopened months later, vines twisting through the crates, yet among the ruins, fragments of communication still moved, scrawled notes hidden in rifle barrels, carved messages on bamboo stakes, rumors passed by whisper from one starving post to another. The jungle became a living archive of unfinished sentences. Corporal Masanobu Hara, who had once carried coded orders across these same hills, returned to the area years after the war. In an interview with NHK, he described finding a fragment of his own handwriting on a bamboo splinter near the Chindwin River. It was mine. The same character for wind. I couldn't remember writing it. What makes a message survive when the men who carried it cannot? The Imphal campaign had drained the Empire's reserves. Hundreds of couriers vanished between June and August, not from combat but from hunger. By that autumn, survivors described boiling shoe leather for soup, grinding bark into flour. The official army ration, 1,900 calories, had collapsed to barely 600. And yet somewhere within that deprivation, a stubborn pride endured. One courier, interviewed by a Red Cross inspection team after the war, recalled reciting the Emperor's orders aloud each morning, even when there was no one left to hear. The words had to exist, even if only the trees listened. That image, a lone man speaking to trees, captured the tragedy of the Empire's silence better than any communique. The Allies pressed forward, radios crackling with coordinates, bombers charting the jungle in grids. A British soldier stationed near Kabau Valley later described the contrast in a letter home. "We fight with engines. They fight with echoes. Those echoes lingered." Villagers in Lahe and Tamu claimed that, long after the fighting ended, they still heard footsteps in the night, rhythmic, human, moving in lines that led nowhere. They called them the Ghost Runners. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the news took weeks to reach the surviving couriers hiding in the hills. Some refused to believe it, convinced that silence was another Allied trick. One diary recovered in 1950, its pages fused by mildew, ends with 4 words, "Still waiting for orders." In a sense, the Empire was waiting too, for its own voice to return. As the jungle reclaimed the paths, the last dispatch pouch dissolved into the soil. Inside, the paper had rotted into a soft pulp of fiber and rain. Yet the faint imprint of ink, the shape of words, still clung to the page like memory itself, refusing to vanish entirely. That remnant would outlast the Empire it once served. Winter sunlight fell across the barbed wire at Camp Hearn, Texas glinting off frost and metal, as if the horizon itself had been solid shut. By January 1946, the war was over, but the men inside still marched every morning, their boots drumming a rhythm that once belonged to the vanished Reich. Here, among the flat fields and eucalyptus windbreaks, German prisoners of war learned that the world beyond the wire had changed faster than they could imagine. The U.S. War Department's inspection report, dated January 14, 1946, describes the scene with bureaucratic precision. Population 4803, daily caloric intake 3,300, academic instruction, moderate attendance, 67% literacy sessions. It was an empire of routine, now repurposed for something unprecedented, re-education. At dawn, men who had once carried Mausers now carried chalk. Classrooms replaced trenches. English grammar was taught beside lessons on democracy, civic rights, and world geography. The U.S. Army's re-education branch called it Operation University. By August 1946, its records from Fort Eustis, Virginia showed 4,217 active enrollees across U.S. POW camps, the largest such program in modern history. Imagine the contrast. The same men who once memorized the Führer's decrees, now reading aloud from the Federalist Papers under the Texas sun. One guard at Hearn, Private Donald Reeves, later recalled in a local newspaper interview, "They studied harder than we ever did in high school. Maybe they were learning freedom by repetition." The POWs organized orchestras, printed camp newspapers, debated philosophy under watchtowers. In the evenings, some played Beethoven on out-of-tune pianos salvaged from nearby schools. A half-eaten apple might sit on a classroom desk beside a copy of the Houston Chronicle, open to an article about Truman's new Reconstruction plan. How strange it must have felt to be captive, yet freer than before. Outside the wire, the contradictions of America deepened the lesson. Black soldiers from the 92nd Infantry Division stood guard at the gates. while German prisoners, men from a nation that had institutionalized racial hierarchy, received fair rations and medical care. One POW reportedly murmured, "In this land, the prisoner eats beside the Negro, and both salute the same flag." That moment, recorded in a Red Cross visit summary, carried a quiet revolution of its own. The re-education officers, many of them university professors drafted into service, believed they were planting seeds for a democratic Germany. Courses included journalism, public ethics, and even mechanical engineering. One instructor noted the irony. They build model planes that will never fly to learn a future that might, and yet, beneath this idealism lay unease. Some prisoners resisted, calling the program mind occupation. They whispered about returning home as strangers, men who spoke of ballots instead of banners, but the tide of history was relentless. Across the U.S., from Camp Swift in Texas to Camp Algona in Iowa, the same transformation played out. Field gray uniforms traded for books, dogma for doubt. In Hearn's small chapel rebuilt from scrap lumber, Christmas 1946 was celebrated with a choir that sang in both German and English. A Red Cross inspector noted simply, "Voices carried over the wire, tone even unbroken." By spring, the camp's notice board displayed a headline from the Dallas Morning News, "Marshall Plan Draft Nearing Approval." The prisoners read it aloud, as if decoding prophecy, a plan that promised food, jobs and rebuilding instead of ruin. The skies that once rained bombs now carried cargo planes of relief. The same air that had once written destruction now wrote deliverance. And so, under the wide Texan sky, a different kind of war began. Not of bullets, but of ideas. Snow drifted across the barracks roofs of Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, settling into soft ridges that muffled every sound. Beneath that stillness, the camp library glowed with amber light. Shelves built from scrap pine were lined with borrowed volumes, 12,840 books, according to the U.S. Army Educational Service Library log of March 1947. Inside, German POWs hunched over English dictionaries, atlases, and history texts that smelled faintly of dust and machine oil. A small stove crackled in the corner. Every turn of a page felt like the lifting of a curtain, thin, fragile, and dangerous in its promise of another world. Books are a slow kind of freedom, one prisoner wrote later in a repatriation diary found among Geneva's ICRC archives. Each word takes you one step outside the fence. The ICRC inspector Henri Chapuis, who visited in June 1947, noted the same phenomenon. His report reads, "Attendance high, morale improved. Camp McCoy Library functions as unofficial civic school. Reading demand exceeds supply." The war had once been a contest of engines, artillery, and coded orders. Now it had become a war of sentences, a struggle for meaning itself. Every evening at 7, after the final roll call, the library filled again. Men in wool coats read quietly under flickering bulbs salvaged from the motor pool. Some traced English words onto paper scraps. Others debated the concept of Freiheit, freedom, as though trying to remember what it truly meant. Outside, in the civilian world, America was accelerating into modernity. Veterans returned to college under the GI Bill. Women filled factories still running at wartime capacity. Radio programs debated foreign policy. But within the barbed perimeter, time moved differently. A visiting American journalist, writing for the Milwaukee Sentinel, observed, "Behind the wire, the war seems not yet over, only paused, waiting for translation." That tension filled every corner of Camp McCoy. The German men who studied constitutional law by day worked at nearby lumber mills by dawn, earning 80 cents per day for 8-hour shifts. Logs fed the same industry that supplied their bookshelves, a circular economy of quiet repentance. At times, the contrasts were almost absurd. On Sundays, Lutheran pastors from local congregations led bilingual services in the mess hall. Hymns like Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott rose alongside Amazing Grace, sung in accents that bent vowels into unfamiliar shapes. A chaplain recorded that even unbelievers sang, perhaps out of habit or homesickness. But the most haunting image came not from sermons or study, but from a single act of preservation. In the camp's art room, a former architecture student from Dresden built a miniature of his destroyed university, each column crafted from matchsticks. When asked why, he replied, "So I can return even if only in scale. How does a nation rebuild itself when its very blueprints lie in ash? The re-education effort at McCoy, like dozens of camps across the US, sought to answer that question in paper and ink. By 1947, more than 32 POW libraries had been catalogued under the Educational Service. Together, they circulated over 300,000 volumes before repatriation began. When Inspector Chapuis returned for a final visit that autumn, he noted that the men requested not novels or military histories, but textbooks on agriculture, engineering, and public administration. It was as if they were preparing to rebuild Germany from memory alone. The inspector concluded his report with one sentence: "They study by the light of their own shadows." That image, men reading beside the ghost of their past, became the quiet heart of the post-war story. Each book borrowed, each page turned, was a small act of reconstruction. And in that humble library, surrounded by snow and silence, the foundations of a democratic Germany were already being laid, not in marble or steel, but in words. The ship cut through the Atlantic like a slow, rusted memory. The SS Marine Marlin, a troop transport repurposed for homecomings, left the port of New York on May 12, 1947, its decks lined with 1,236 German prisoners of war. The men stood shoulder to shoulder in silence, staring east. For years they had memorized the ocean as a boundary. Now it was the road home. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps manifest labeled them clinically Convoy R-17, status repatriation, disciplinary record satisfactory. But no document could measure what these men carried: fragments of English words, blurred notebook pages, sketches of Texas sunsets, and the uneasy awareness that they were no longer the same men who had marched away. In their coat pockets, some kept the folded newsletters printed in the camps, Der Ruf, the Callquarken essays about democracy, ethics, and rebuilding. These pamphlets would later inspire the first civilian journal of the same name in the American zone of occupied Germany. History, it seemed, was already being smuggled ashore inside the folds of paper. For 3 weeks the ocean stretched on, cold and metallic, the horizon wrapped in fog. Each evening, the men lined up along the deck to listen to BBC radio bulletins broadcast in German, updates on rationing, the Marshall Plan, and the trials still underway in Nuremberg. One prisoner, a former courier sergeant named Otto Brenner, wrote in his diary, "We sail toward a verdict written by others." When the Marine Marlin finally docked at Bremerhaven, the air smelled of coal smoke and salt. Dock workers watched as the men disembarked, some limping, some shielding their eyes from the northern sun. Waiting Red Cross nurses issued bread, coffee, and vaccination cards. For many, it was the first cup of German coffee they'd tasted in 4 years. Weak, sweetened with beet sugar, served in tin mugs still warm from the boiler. From Bremerhaven, trains carried them south through landscapes that looked like X-rays of a nation, skeletal factories, shattered rail depots, rivers still clogged with wreckage. On June 3, 1947, Nuremberg Depot recorded the arrival of 612 men from the convoy. The Bavarian Reconstruction Office logbook listed them by occupation: teachers, mechanics, farmers, clerks. In one column, the clerk had written a single word beside several names: Heimkehrer, homecomer. But what did home mean now? The city they entered was half rubble, half rebirth. American jeeps idled beside carts pulled by horses. Children played among bricks where cathedrals had stood. Loudspeakers on street corners played Allied news in German. The Marshall Plan approved in principle, food aid arriving. For the returnees, every sound was both familiar and foreign. In one makeshift resettlement hall, a repatriate school was already open, teaching the same democratic civics they had studied behind wire. The chalkboard still bore an English phrase from a prior class: "Freedom begins with understanding." That evening, as dusk fell over the city, Otto Brenner watched a train pass under the shadow of the ruined courthouse. Its carriages carried barrels marked U.S. Relief Flour, Munich District. He wrote his last diary line that night: "The road home is built with foreign hands, but it leads to us." It was not a triumphant return, but a quiet reckoning, a march through silence, through hunger, through a new kind of duty. As the church bells of Nuremberg tolled for curfew, the men of Convoy R-17 disappeared into the streets, carrying with them the invisible weight of 2 worlds, one lost to fire, the other waiting to be built from its ashes, and somewhere, deep in the cargo hold of the ship now moored empty at Bremerhaven, a single notebook remained, its cover stamped Camp Hearn Educational Office. Inside in careful German script, the final line read, "Tomorrow we will begin again." The first snow of 1948 fell softly over Frankfurt, covering the city's ruins like paper laid over a wound. Beneath the scaffolds and cranes, something unfamiliar stirred, a rhythm of typewriters, printing presses, rebuilding hands. The war's thunder had faded into the quiet hum of a republic being born. According to U.S. Military Government Report Number 64, issued that September, 412 former POWs had already been reintegrated into civilian life. Teachers, engineers, city clerks, even a handful of journalists who once edited the camp newsletters of Hearn and McCoy. Each entry in the report was a fragment of rebirth, a statistic with a pulse. But this new Germany did not rise from marble proclamations. It rose from habits learned in confinement, discipline, dialogue, and the belief that ideas could outlast empires. The Heimkehrer, the homecomers, became the silent carriers of that ethic. In the schools of Nuremberg, returned soldiers taught children how to question authority without fear. In Hamburg, former camp instructors organized civic reading circles. And in a bombed-out church in Dortmund, one man hung a sign above the door, "Learn, so that never again we obey without thought." How strange that the roots of democracy had been sown in captivity. In that same winter, the first shipments of the Marshall Plan arrived. Sacks of flour, machinery parts, crates marked U.S. aid, ERP 1949. The allocation records from December 1949 list $1.39 billion directed to the German sector. It was not only money, it was the scaffolding of trust. American engineers worked alongside former enemies in factories where women now operated cranes and lathes. In one Ruhr steel mill, a reporter for Die Neue Zeitung described a moment that captured the paradox perfectly. A German foreman and a black American technician share a cigarette during the lunch break. Around them, furnaces roar for peace. The same world that had once divided by race and ideology, now built together in the language of production quotas and pay stubs. Yet memory remained uneasy. In small towns, the returnees walked among those who had not been captured, and silence filled the spaces where explanation should have been. The past was heavy but unspoken. The rebuilding required not forgetting, but learning how to remember without hate. In Bavaria, village councils formed civic committees under U.S. supervision. Former POWs often led them, their camp education now a qualification for leadership. One council record from Schwandorf, dated March 1950, lists among its first motions: establish public library, encourage youth exchange with France. The war that had begun with messengers carrying orders through jungles now ended with letters exchanged between students across borders. From Tokyo to Texas to the Rhine, the thread of communication, once written in code, and now written in trust, had come full circle. By 1951, the U.S. press began calling it the Quiet Republic, a nation rebuilt not by conquest, but by conscience. One former POW, Werner Kohl, who had studied English at Camp Hearn, would later become a schoolteacher near Würzburg. In his first civics lesson, he wrote on the board, "Freedom is the ability to listen." When a student asked where he learned it, he smiled and said only, "In Texas." Outside, church bells rang again over the rebuilt town squares. The air smelled of diesel, new bread, and the ink of freshly printed newspapers, the small fragrances of normalcy. And so, amid the quiet labor of the post-war years, a truth emerged more enduring than any victory. That redemption, like reconstruction, begins with the courage to understand. The couriers had once run through jungles carrying the empire's orders. Now their descendants carried ballots, blueprints, and letters of peace. The old roads had vanished beneath forests and highways. But the message endured, passed hand to hand across a changed world. In the end, history's greatest transformation was not written by generals or governments, but by ordinary men who learned within captivity how to be free. The jungle trails became highways, the dispatches became lessons, and the silence what became democracy.